In 2017, a convicted prisoner serving time for transnational bribery somehow managed to unite the nation's president, major media outlets, and powerful business conglomerates in a campaign for his release. Millions of citizens echoed the same message online: set him free. Otherwise, our country is doomed. As absurd as it sounds, this wasn't the plot of a movie. It was reality in South Korea. Today, we're diving into one of the most extraordinary stories in modern business history: Samsung, the invisible empire that has become deeply intertwined with the fate of an entire nation. Officially, the country is known as the Republic of Korea. But among economists and even many Koreans themselves, it has earned a more unusual nickname: the Republic of Samsung. In South Korea, there are three things you can never escape: death, taxes, and Samsung. That isn't an exaggeration. It's a reflection of reality. A Korean citizen may be born in a Samsung-owned hospital, live in a Samsung-built apartment, and carry a Samsung smartphone. They may attend a university funded by Samsung, work in a Samsung office tower, and purchase insurance from Samsung affiliates. Even their final farewell could take place at a Samsung-operated medical facility. Samsung has become as essential to daily life as air and water. To understand the scale of Samsung's influence, let's look at the numbers. At its peak, Samsung Group generated nearly $300 billion in annual revenue. What does that actually mean? At one point, Samsung alone accounted for roughly 20% of South Korea's GDP. In other words, for every $5 generated in the Korean economy, about $1 carried Samsung's imprint. Samsung has also been responsible for nearly 1/5 of the country's exports. Within South Korea's KOSPI stock market, Samsung Electronics alone has often represented between 20% and 25% of the entire market's value. This extreme concentration of wealth has created something almost unprecedented in economic history. The fate of an entire nation became deeply tied to the success of a single corporation. When Samsung prospers, South Korea prospers. When Samsung struggles, South Korea feels the impact. So, how was this corporate empire built? And how did it survive fierce global competition through a series of seemingly reckless bets? To find the answer, we need to go back more than 80 years, to a tiny trading company with a very humble beginning. Today, Samsung oversees assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars, but its origins were remarkably modest. In 1938, in the city of Daegu, a young entrepreneur named Lee Byung-chul started a small trading business called Samsung Sangho with just 30,000 won from his family. Back then, Samsung wasn't making smartphones or semiconductors. Its business was exporting dried fish, vegetables, and fruit to Northeast China. What truly changed Samsung's destiny was the alliance between political power and economic ambition. After the Korean War ended in the 1950s, South Korea was devastated. Its GDP per capita was even lower than that of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. In 1961, strongman leader Park Chung-hee came to power through a military coup. He understood that if South Korea wanted to survive, it had to industrialize. The problem was simple: the government lacked capital, and the country had no major corporations capable of driving industrial growth. So Park's government struck what many would later call a devil's bargain with a handful of businessmen led by Lee Byung-chul. The government would provide policy protection, low-interest loans, and strict control of foreign competition. In return, these business leaders were expected to build the industries the nation desperately needed, including textiles, fertilizers, and shipbuilding. This arrangement became the foundation of what the world would later call the Miracle on the Han River. It was also the starting point for the rise of Korea's powerful chaebols. With massive government support behind it, Samsung expanded at breathtaking speed. Within just a few years, it had become one of the largest corporations in South Korea. However, the moment that truly set Samsung on the path to global dominance was still ahead. It would come in the form of Lee Byung-chul's final and most audacious gamble. In 1983, Lee Byung-chul was 73 years old and battling cancer. That year, he delivered what became known as the Tokyo Declaration, shocking the business world. Samsung would commit enormous resources to enter the semiconductor industry, a field then dominated almost entirely by American and Japanese companies. To many observers, Samsung had lost its mind. A Korean company that had yet to fully master color television technology was now attempting to challenge the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturers. But Lee Byung-chul and his successor, Lee Kun-hee, saw the bigger picture. As long as Samsung remained an assembler, it would stay at the bottom of the global value chain. If it wanted real pricing power, it had to capture one of the crown jewels of modern technology: DRAM memory chips. That decision would trigger one of the most brutal and dramatic battles in corporate history. In the semiconductor industry, there is a famous survival strategy known as counter-cyclical investing. Semiconductors are highly cyclical by nature. When demand surges, profits explode. But when supply exceeds demand, prices collapse and the entire industry suffers. Most companies facing a downturn respond by cutting costs, laying off workers, and reducing production. Samsung chose a completely different path. Its strategy could be summed up in 4 words: attack against the cycle. In 1984, Samsung had just developed its first 64K DRAM chip. Almost immediately, the global semiconductor industry entered a severe downturn. Chip prices crashed from around $4 per unit to just 30 cents. Samsung's production cost was approximately $1.30 per chip. Every chip sold meant losing roughly $1. Over the next 3 years, Samsung lost nearly $300 million in its semiconductor division. The company effectively burned through profits accumulated from its traditional businesses. Bankruptcy seemed dangerously close. For most publicly traded companies in the West, facing pressure from shareholders and boards of directors, the logical move would have been to exit the industry. But Samsung had a unique advantage. Behind it stood the Lee family and a South Korean government that had tied much of its economic future to Samsung's success. The South Korean government stepped in directly, providing Samsung with massive low-interest loans and generous research subsidies. Instead of retreating, Lee Kun-hee reportedly made a decision that stunned the industry. Keep investing, expand production, increase research and development. Samsung's logic was both simple and ruthless: leverage the financial support available behind the company and aggressively expand production during the industry's darkest moments. Drive prices so low that competitors can no longer survive. Let's see who can endure longer. This strategy became known as suicidal expansion. Eventually, Japan's semiconductor giants began to crack under the pressure. Companies such as Toshiba, Hitachi, and NEC saw their market share steadily eroded after years of heavy losses. Many were forced to cut investments or abandon parts of the DRAM market altogether. Even Micron found its profitability under intense pressure. Then, the cycle turned. As demand returned and chip prices surged, buyers discovered there were far fewer suppliers left in the market. Samsung, having expanded aggressively during the downturn, controlled enormous manufacturing capacity. The company not only recovered its previous losses, but went on to generate tens of billions of dollars in profits. During both the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the 2008 global financial crisis, Samsung refined this counter-cyclical strategy into a powerful competitive weapon. While competitors struggled, Samsung continued investing and gained ground against rivals from Japan and Taiwan. Several major players, including Germany's Qimonda and Japan's Elpida, eventually disappeared from the battlefield. By 2010, what had once been a crowded industry with dozens of competitors had consolidated into a market dominated by only a handful of players, with Samsung at the top. Samsung Electronics established itself as the undisputed leader of the global memory chip market. Its profit margins frequently exceeded 50%. Thanks to its dominance in DRAM memory, Samsung Electronics became the brightest jewel in Samsung Group's crown. But in business, no throne lasts forever. As the world entered the second decade of the 21st century, the seemingly unstoppable technology empire found itself under pressure from every direction. Samsung Electronics relies on three major profit engines: semiconductors, smartphones, and display panels. Today, all three are under attack from powerful competitors. First comes the smartphone market. For years, Samsung and Apple have competed neck and neck in global shipments. Samsung even established an early lead in foldable devices. But financial reports reveal a harsh reality. Apple captures more than 80% of the smartphone industry's profits. Samsung may sell enormous numbers of devices, yet in the premium segment, it struggles against the powerful lock-in of Apple's ecosystem. The Galaxy flagship lineup has never achieved overwhelming dominance. Meanwhile, in the mid-range and budget markets, Chinese smartphone manufacturers have leveraged aggressive pricing and rapid innovation to steadily eat away at Samsung's market share around the world. If smartphone competition is merely a surface wound, then the semiconductor foundry business presents a far more serious challenge. Here, Samsung faces its greatest rival, TSMC. The chip industry is divided into design and manufacturing. Samsung follows the IDM model, handling everything from design to fabrication and packaging. For decades, this model was highly profitable. However, as manufacturing processes approached the cutting edge of 3nm and 2nm technology, Samsung's weaknesses became increasingly visible. Those weaknesses can be summed up in two words: yield rates and customer trust. Samsung doesn't just manufacture chips, it also designs and sells its own processors. As a result, leading chip designers such as Qualcomm, Apple, and Nvidia often hesitate when considering Samsung for their most advanced manufacturing contracts. After all, why hand your most valuable blueprints to a company that could potentially become your competitor? TSMC, on the other hand, built its reputation on one simple principle: never compete with your customers. The outcome was almost inevitable. Major contracts from companies like Qualcomm and Nvidia increasingly flowed toward TSMC. At the same time, Samsung faced recurring concerns about manufacturing yields in advanced process technologies. Industry reports frequently questioned the efficiency of Samsung's early 3nm production lines. In the foundry market, TSMC captured more than half of global market share. Samsung, meanwhile, remained stuck at roughly 15%. The once untouchable technology giant was beginning to feel pressure in the very semiconductor industry that had made it powerful. In South Korea, there is a widely used economic expression: the big horse never dies. The idea is simple. A giant like Samsung is so important that the government will never allow it to fail. Yet this assumption that certain companies cannot be allowed to fail has become one of the deepest structural problems in the Korean economy. Because conglomerates such as Samsung, Hyundai, SK, and LG collectively account for an enormous share of South Korea's economic output. This has created a highly imbalanced economic structure. Small and medium-sized businesses often struggle to survive. Many become low-margin suppliers, serving the chaebols. Others find themselves squeezed out before they can grow into serious competitors. The result is a significant constraint on innovation. For many young Koreans seeking upward mobility, the safest path is admission to an elite university. After that comes another intense competition, fighting for a limited number of stable jobs at major conglomerates like Samsung and Hyundai. Those who fail often find themselves trapped in less secure forms of employment. Extreme competition and concentrated economic power have frequently been cited as factors behind South Korea's low birth rate and high levels of social pressure. Even more remarkable than economic power is political influence. In 2017, Samsung heir Lee Jae-yong was sentenced to prison over a bribery scandal. At the time, public sentiment strongly favored reforming the chaebol system. Yet only a few years later, as economic growth began to slow, concerns started spreading throughout both society and politics. Without Lee Jae-yong, Samsung cannot make multi-billion-dollar investment decisions. If Samsung stops moving forward, the Korean economy could suffer. Ultimately, in 2022, the South Korean president granted Lee Jae-yong a pardon, citing national economic interests. This highlights one of the great ironies of modern Korea. Beyond laws and political institutions, many critics argue that an unwritten form of chaebol immunity continues to exist. Through its wealth and influence, Samsung has built an invisible empire that few institutions can easily challenge. Even while recognizing the long-term risks, successive governments have repeatedly found themselves compromising with the chaebols. The perceived cost of a major Samsung collapse is simply too high. The tide of business never stops moving forward. By the mid-2020s, the world entered a transformative new era driven by artificial intelligence. In the AI boom sparked by technologies like ChatGPT and powered by companies such as NVIDIA, Samsung, long accustomed to dominating the memory market, suddenly found itself falling behind. In the race to develop HBM, or high-bandwidth memory, the critical component behind advanced AI chips, Samsung's strategic miscalculations allowed its longtime domestic rival, SK Hynix, to seize the spotlight. NVIDIA's most advanced AI accelerators, which power much of today's AI revolution, relied heavily on memory supplied by SK Hynix. Meanwhile, Samsung found itself struggling through lengthy qualification and testing processes. For a giant of Samsung's size, changing direction is never easy. From a small trading company selling dried fish and apples in Daegu back in 1938, to a global technology powerhouse whose influence reaches every corner of the world, Samsung's rise mirrors the rise of modern South Korea itself. And Samsung's challenges reflect the anxieties of a nation facing a new era of uncertainty. The foundation of Samsung's historic success was counter-cyclical investing, a strategy that requires enormous capital and the ability to absorb mistakes. But in the age of artificial intelligence, can yesterday's playbook still deliver tomorrow's victories? Decades ago, Samsung could outlast rivals by investing aggressively when others retreated. Today's AI race, however, is about far more than money. It demands elite talent, software ecosystems, algorithmic expertise, and influence across global supply chains. Samsung remains one of the most powerful technology companies on Earth. Yet for perhaps the first time in its history, it is no longer the hunter leading the chase. Instead, it faces challengers on every front. One thing is certain. In this high-stakes global technology battle, Samsung cannot afford to lose. Because standing behind it is a nation with few alternatives, a nation that has tied much of its future to Samsung's success. For decades, many believed Samsung was simply too big to fail. Yet today, it faces historic labor disputes at home while confronting fierce competition in the global AI race. Can Samsung stage another comeback? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.